Okay, I guess we'll get going. We are recording and transcribing for folks who are here for your information. Welcome everyone. My name is Risa Shimoda. I'm the Executive Director of the River Management Society, and I'm thrilled to have you here. We have a lot of people signed up, and I think you'll find that we have a really awesome panel today of people who know about this topic really well and from slightly different perspectives. So that's even better because we'll get, I think, a nice understanding of a very, very complicated topic. So we're here to talk about the important topic of protecting endangered species, specifically fish, and that we love the idea of free-flowing rivers, especially as they relate to wild and scenic rivers in the United States, and that they sometimes don't agree with each other, that Endangered Species Act and the protections related to that don't agree necessarily with the tenets of wild and scenic rivers is, like I said, complicated and important to understand. And we'll see where we end at the end of the discussion.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angie Braley. I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society, and I'm going to be also helping, keeping an eye on the chat today during today's session, but just happy that you're all here to join us for our monthly River Management Roundtable. So every month we get together on the second Tuesday and we host virtual conversations and discussions for river professionals in all different types of sectors. Really, our goal is to facilitate an open forum and to support everyone's work managing rivers. So hoping to tackle some issues by asking questions, sharing solutions, and kind of building a community of practice. So today, just a couple program notes as we're going through the session. As Risa mentioned, we are recording and we will be putting this on YouTube afterwards, and we'll be emailing out a link to everyone who has registered for this session today. Love to see your faces when we're having discussion and know that we're not the only ones here. But really importantly is just trying to stay muted. I know we got a large group today. That being said, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat and put them in there. We'll have some time for questions at the end, and we'll also kind of see if there's anything that we need to answer throughout. We can answer it in the chat box too. And then just, the rules of being nice, listening, and respecting one another. So with that being said, I would like to welcome our three panelists today, or speakers, Matt, Kate, and Kestrel, and I'm going to invite them each to introduce themselves. So we'll start with you, Matt.
Hello, I'm Matt O'Neill. I'm currently with the Bureau of Reclamation, and so I am largely responsible for causing a lot of the barrier problems. My agency causes a lot of the barrier problems that we'll talk about today. But I'm really here representing more of a fish biology perspective. And so this isn't really a reclamation-oriented talk. I'm just talking about fish conservation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Day. I'm the Watershed Program Manager on the Coconino National Forest. I identify as a hydrologist as well as a fluvial geomorphologist. I'm relatively new to the Coconino National Forest in Flagstaff, Arizona. I've spent most of my career in the Pacific Northwest, actually in anadromous fish habitat where we were removing barriers, but also have some experience with hydropower regulation projects on National Forest System lands and construction of fish barriers. Glad to be here today.
And my name is Kestrel Coons. I'm the Southern Rockies Protection Director for American Whitewater. I am usually based in Crested Butte, Colorado, and I have the pleasure of working on a lot of our regional wild and scenic river campaigns, federal land management plans, wild and scenic eligibility studies, and a lot of other policy work. And that has recently intersected with a number of different fish barrier proposals and ideas and conflicts. And so excited to talk about all that today with you guys.
So just some background, and many of you in this space today might know these backwards and forwards. They're pieces of legislation that have been really, really important for everyone in our country. One is Endangered Species Act. It's been around since '73. The agencies that are responsible for maintaining its tenets are to protect endangered and threatened species and their habitats, both our NOAA fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they'll share responsibility for some of these critters, these wonderful critters, and other agencies, as I've come to learn, may be protecting a species on a forest or in a BLM unit, and they will go to these guys for advice and or approval. So they're responsible, but they work with all the other federal agencies as directed by Section 7 and interagency cooperation of the ESA. Next slide, please. And then the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which came around a little bit before. So the job of this act is to protect and enhance specific identified scenic, recreational, geologic, fish, wildlife, historic, cultural, or other values on selected rivers. They may have only one of those values to protect, and they may have all of those, and they may have others, depending on what is viewed as valuable in a certain region relative to the reach of the river that is being protected. And importantly, these rivers are supposed to be protected in their current free-flowing condition, meaning free-flowing as of the time of designation. And then their environment shall be protected for benefit for present and future generations. Part of that, next slide, please. And yeah, so there are two kind of components that are of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that are important. And a federal water resources project is anything that's funded with federal money. And a project that might be controversial or problematic is something that's viewed to have a direct and adverse effect on the value that the river is protected for. So that sounds pretty basic, but that can define whether or not a value is important or not when a water resources project is being considered. And then another section is that components should be administered, meaning the components of the act that are protected, areas that are protected, shall be administered to protect and enhance identified values without limiting other uses that do not substantially interfere with public use and enjoyment. So protect and enhance is the other kind of phrase that you hear a lot. A value might be not like pristine and perfect and awesome, but whatever it is at the time of designation needs to be protected at least at that level or made better. So that's what we're talking about. And I'm going to hand it to Matt, who's going to go now into an explanation of why we're here today. What makes this controversial? What makes this complicated?
Thanks, Lisa. So Matt O'Neill, we can flip slides, please. Currently reclamation, but I've also worked for the Forest Service and Arizona Game and Fish in a couple of different capacities. And so I'm kind of bring a broad agency perspective. And so just looking at the threats to aquatic systems, we all know that there's a lot of threats to aquatic habitat and aquatic species. But one of the biggest ones that we worry about when we're talking about native fish is invasive species. Slide, please. And so invasive species will compete with and prey upon native fish species. And there's been 4 or 5 decades now in the desert Southwest, a long time, a lot of evidence showing population declines of native fish species, many local extirpations, and kind of big top-down food web type habitat changes when non-native species take over a stream or are introduced into a stream. Slide, please. And so as some of those native fish get more and more impacted, they might become threatened and endangered, and then they begin to rate protection under the Endangered Species Act. And so kind of big picture, the Endangered Species Act will help develop recovery plans, or outside of that, there might be conservation agreements that might help preclude listing of a species. And those conservation plans might require a set number of species to allow for population, for a set number of, a set number of populations to allow for a species to be downlisted or even delisted. And within that recovery plan, habitat requirements will almost always require a water that is free of the important threats. And for fish, those important threats are always going to include non-native species. And then on top of that, or in addition to that, federal and non-federal actions that might impact species may require mitigation to help protect those species. Slide, please. And so who actually does the management and who oversees the kind of the big picture planning kind of varies by species and the threat level of each species. But really every agency has some kind of role to play. And so, for example, I'm with Reclamation right now. So I'm considered one of those in the bottom here, one of those other public entities that does actions that negatively affect imperiled species. And therefore, we consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who writes a biological opinion to help us manage the impacts that we're doing, that we might be applying to those species, and then mitigate them when possible. Slide, please. So ultimately, the problems that we face here are that native and non-native fish just cannot coexist. Like, there are several species of non-native fish, particularly smallmouth bass and green sunfish, that will essentially eradicate many species of native fish. And so they cannot co-occur. And problem number two is that there are really no methods of effectively controlling populations of those species. And so we can net them, we can electrofish them, we can try and play with genetic techniques. But the bottom line is there's no real way to manage invasive species that isn't scorched earth. We can put chemicals into the water that will kill most gill-breathing organisms, and we can eradicate non-native fish in that way. But that's not a where we'd also be killing all the native fish, and so that's not a solution that we use unless we absolutely have to. And on top of all that, there are a very limited number of streams that have suitable habitat for native fish. And as you all know now, a lot of the streams that have habitat for native fish are also streams where we want to do a lot of other things and that people want to use for lots of different reasons. Slide, please. And so the way that the overarching way that we manage fish in the desert Southwest is basically segregation. And so we need to keep populations of native fish away from populations of non-native fish. And the way that we've developed to do that, and very much the royal we here, not me at all, is by building fish barriers. And so building structures that prevent upstream movement of all fish. And so this is the way that we've found to be able to long-term, sustainably, with relatively low amounts of maintenance, prevent non-native fish from interacting and essentially eradicating the native fish species. And fish barriers have lots of different traits, many of which can be negative, potentially negative for a flowing stream. But I'm sure we'll talk about that later today. Slide, please. And so here in the Southwest, in the Gila River Basin, is kind of one of the big target areas for fish barrier construction. So Bureau of Reclamation manages the Central Arizona Project Canal System, and that's has had negative impacts on the Gila River Basin by introducing non-native species. And so through the biological opinion, Reclamation was directed to build 12 fish barriers. And so they've currently constructed 8, and they've got plans for several more in the potentially not too distant future. And so this is the way that Reclamation's mitigation of the Central Arizona Project impacts is kind of helping conserve native fish species. Slide, please. And so one of the things that we see is that because of the methods that we have to use to conserve native fish species, using the technologies that we have right now, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act could potentially prevent conservation actions that are required under the Endangered Species Act for recovering these threatened and endangered species. And so if fish barriers can't be built in areas that are required under the ESA for having a conservation population, then essentially these species might never be down or delisted. And that can also happen in the opposite direction. And so the requirement to build a fish barrier in a certain area could potentially inhibit stream protections under WSRA. And then even within WSRA 2, there are potentially conflicts. And so if a native fish population is going to be considered an ORV for a stream, then that being able to protect that ORV doesn't necessarily coincide with protecting other values such as free flow or possibly recreation and other aspects like that. And so I think that's the end of my presentation. So I will hand it off to Kate Day to talk more about some of those laws.
Okay, so thanks, Matt. So I'm going to talk today kind of about how the Forest Service considers fish barriers in our overall kind of program of all of the things that we need to think about when we manage. Next slide, please. Okay, so ultimately, our guiding document on every national forest across the country is a forest plan. And those forest plans are updated every 20 to 30 years, 15 in a perfect world, but that never happens. And those forest plans designate management areas. They designate if we have recommendations for wild and scenic rivers. They also discuss wilderness areas. And so basically, it's like a cookbook about what particular actions can occur on which areas on a national forest. And those forest plans also include standards and guidelines, which are basically measures that we take to protect all the resources that we manage. And so with regards to fish barriers, often forest plans are fairly specific about fish barriers, and it really depends on what national forest you're on and what those considerations look like. So for example, the Northwest Forest Plan, which covers parts of Northern California as well as Washington and Oregon, definitely precludes barrier construction in most places because we have anadromous fish habitat there and anadromous fish. And so we're actually looking at removing barriers. In places where we have more residential fisheries systems, forest plans will often specify standards and guidelines for barrier construction. You know, if it meets all these other parameters, then the Forest Service can do that action. Next slide. So as far as how we manage fisheries, we have the broad forest plans, and then we have a plethora of other agencies and collaborators that we collaborate with to manage fish resources, as well as decisions on barriers. So our state fish and game agencies, I say they're ultimately responsible. It's a lot of other agencies that are responsible as well, but they really are responsible for the day-to-day management of both native as well as sport fisheries. And then we also work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well as the National Marine Fisheries Service on Endangered Species Act compliance and regulation, and that's a very collaborative process. And then partners are incredibly involved in fisheries management. So everything from tribes, local tribes, NGOs, as well as hydropower companies, other utilities are often very involved. So if we're looking at a potential barrier construction on Forest Service land, the Forest Service is ultimately responsible for all of the legal compliance and making sure that we are within the bounds of our forest plan, as well as all other laws, regulations, and policies. So some of the big ones would be the National Environmental Policy Act, and that is the act that basically prescribes that we will disclose effects of projects and mitigate those effects as best that we can. The Endangered Species Act, as we've talked about quite a bit. Also the Historic Preservation Act, which is kind of a huge thing that we often have to think about if we're going to be impeding the free flow of rivers. Are there historic properties behind those waters that might be affected? We also are responsible for the Clean Water Act, and we do that collaboratively with state water quality agencies, as well as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and then wilderness management. And each wilderness area really depends on the legislation that specified that wilderness, what is possible in that wilderness. There's usually not specific language about barriers, but there are some things that are grandfathered into certain wilderness areas. So that's another thing that we really need to think about. Next slide, please. So when we're talking specifically about wild and scenic rivers, that forest plan guidance usually will specify if a forest is, or if a water is potentially eligible. And then there is another process, which is actually a NEPA or National Environmental Policy Act process that the Forest Service needs to go through to analyze if a river is suitable. And we'll look at a brief example of that in a moment. And then the next step would be for Congress to actually designate a river as wild and scenic. We also need to make sure that any action that we take in a designated wild and scenic river specifies that we do not harm any of that outstanding remarkable values, and that the free-flowing condition is protected for the health of future generations of that river. And then, as I alluded to, we also need, if a lot of times wild and scenic rivers are also in wilderness areas, and we need to make sure that we comply with Wilderness Act as well. Next slide. And then just to go into a little bit more details on that, if we're looking at a fish barrier, we need to make sure that that action is not likely to adversely affect a wild and scenic river. So we're really looking at, is that fish barrier going to change the natural flow patterns of this river? Is it going to change the natural flow processes? We also need to make sure, if we are constructing a fish barrier, that we are prescribing design elements, those standard and guidelines, to protect those outstandingly remarkable values, and also design criteria during the implementation, as well as, you know, the actual management of that structure to protect water quality. Next slide. So that's kind of the big picture. So if we're actually looking at a specific project, kind of some of the considerations that the Forest Service would look at. So what is the overall fish management framework of where this barrier is going to be constructed? What does success actually look like? We want to look at the system holistically. And sometimes that could mean that we're looking at barrier management on more of a tributary system rather than a main stem. It's sometimes way easier to manage fish populations in a smaller system rather than going to the big system. We also would like to look at, can the barrier be temporary? Does it need to be permanent and meet the long-term values, or is the management structure such that it could just be a temporary structure and we wouldn't need that long-term? Also, as I mentioned, we want to look at historic preservation, what historic properties might be impacted from the construction of the barrier or of that pool that might form behind the barrier, wilderness values, and of course, our outstandingly remarkable values and the free-flowing characteristics. So just a quick example, I think on the last time that there was, that people convened around this topic, there was a lot of discussion of the Fossil Creek barrier, which is on the Coconino National Forest. So that was basically an example of a construction of a fish barrier where there was already a natural falls, and that fall was actually augmented. So basically it was using the system as it already existed. It was really a step pool fall system, and it was augmenting that fall. So I think the argument was made that it really was not affecting the free flow character of Fossil Creek in the way that maybe some larger barriers that Matt showed some photos of might affect a system geomorphically. And so myself as a geomorphologist, I mean, I asked the question, is that barrier worth it from a fish management perspective to affect the free flowing characteristics and kind of the long-term geomorphic function of a watershed or stream system? Okay, next slide. So here's a recent example. This is a recent NEPA decision on the Prescott National Forest. This is in the Upper Verde watershed. This watershed is managed jointly by the Coconino National Forest and the Prescott National Forest in Arizona. these sections of the Upper Verde were designated as eligible in our respective forest plans. And we actually took the next step to determine if these river segments were suitable. And the confounding factor here was that Bureau of Rec had 2 areas where there are actually plans to construct fish barriers. There's at least engineered plans. We're still in the process. But as you can see here, so the blue section of river was designated as recreational was decided as suitable by the Forest Service. Only Congress can make that final designation. But the suitability analysis and NEPA decision showed a section would be recreational. And then there's a segment in between the blue and the red where the fish barrier would be constructed. And the decision was made that we could not protect those free-flowing values of that potential wild and scenic river and still construct that fish barrier. So the areas that don't have color between the red and the blue, as well as the red and the green, were shown as not suitable by the Forest Service. And I'm going to let Kestrel talk a little bit more about that when she talks. But so the Forest Service really did initially make the decision that we could not construct those barriers and still meet the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And I think that kind of alludes to some of the conversation we have today, that sometimes there may not be compatibility between these 2 things. Okay, last slide. Just going to show one more example, and this is on a very small system, and this is in Northeast Washington, just kind of to demonstrate one type of barrier. So this is Flume Creek on the Colville National Forest, and this is a stream that's managed collaboratively under the Boundary Dam Hydropower Settlement Agreement and license. And Boundary Dam actually supplies about half of Seattle's power. So it's a very large dam and has a huge program of mitigation on the national forest. And you can read these partners here, but very much a joint collaborative effort to manage fisheries resources and improve watershed conditions. So as part of that mitigation package, there's an active program of brook trout eradication in a lot of the tributaries to the main stem dammed system. And so this was a system that was pure brook trout. Brook trout are non-native on the Colville National Forest, and West Slope cutthroat trout are the desirable species in that area. So basically this temporary barrier was constructed so that there could be a program of brook trout eradication. And after that program, after brook trout were eradicated, which is usually about a 3-year program of rotenone application, there were going to be native West Slope cutthroat trout reintroduced into the system. And the thought was that long-term, there would be success with potentially brook trout not recolonizing in this area, or that it would be very easy to treat brook trout through just simple electroshocking means because their numbers would be a lot smaller long-term. And so this barrier was constructed really as a temporary measure, and really we hope that it only lasts about 10 years. And so the decision was made to put this temporary barrier in. This was a very high bed load system. If we put in more of a damming type structure, it would back up very quickly and it would really alter that geomorphology of the system long term. And so a temporary methodology was adopted in this situation. So I just give that example. It's not a wild and scenic river, but just to show there are a lot of different ways to think about these issues and kind of thinking about the timing as well as the overall fish management portfolio of what's going on across the watershed. So now I'm going to kick it over to Kestrel, and yeah, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you, Kate and Matt, for sharing your perspectives and guidance from both the Forest Service and Reclamation. At least from my personal experience working in this space, these are 2 of the federal agencies that I've worked with the most on fish barrier projects, where the agency is either a proponent, a landowner, a decision maker, or a consultant in some way. And so I'm really grateful that they're willing to be a part of this complicated conversation. But as I said, my name is Kestrel Coons, and I do not work for a federal agency. I work for American Whitewater, and we were founded in 1954. Our mission is to protect and restore America's whitewater resources, and to enhance opportunities to enjoy them safely. And so our original members actually played a pretty key role in crafting and passing the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. And that was almost 60 years ago, and we still use it as one of our most common and also most important tools to protect free-flowing rivers. And today, like through that space, we work both to pass new wild and scenic river legislation. We work to secure new eligible and sometimes suitable wild and scenic rivers through federal land management plans. And then we also work on problems like fish barriers and other issues that kind of get at or possibly affect the integrity of the act and its original purpose. So we're working, in the wild and scenic space a lot. We're also recreationists, people, that value free flowing rivers and want to be able to safely paddle down them. And so when you have a proposal for no obstruction in the river that could both affect free flow and also affect safe navigation, becomes important to us. And so that's why we've been a part of this conversation for a little while now. I was a part of the panel last fall, and I'm glad that we're continuing the conversation. But really, proposed fish barriers have intersected with kind of all three layers of that wild and scenic river work. And so in many of our both legislative campaigns and also eligibility studies that we've advocated for, we have run into conflicts with fishery managers and native fish proponents. One example of that is on the Upper Verde, which Kate had mentioned. And just as a little aside there to tack on to what Kate had talked about, one of the, one kind of the cool things that came out of that suitability process was that once those barriers are designed and once that does, pass the, engineering review and all of that, if they are designed in such a way that doesn't impact free flow and that doesn't significantly affect the ORVs, then those river segments will be automatically reverted back to being suitable. And so I actually thought that was a pretty nuanced and creative way to address that problem, at least for the Upper Verde River. But we're also encountering fish barriers on already designated rivers. Another example of that, and that's this photo on the left here, is the Cashlaputa River in Colorado. It's Colorado's actually only wild and scenic river. There is a proposed fish barrier on a wild and wilderness section of this river. And so that's something that we've been involved in trying to figure out, is there a solution that we can come to that both, protects the Wild and Scenic Wilderness Act and then also is able to restore native fish to that river system. And so we keep coming back to this question, and kind of at least a lot of my projects is, can fish barriers and free flowing rivers coexist? Does it have to be either or? And so I have some thoughts. I don't have answers necessarily, but I am eventually curious to hear from some of my other NGO colleagues out there who I know are here. And I will say that, NGOs were not necessarily totally aligned on answers to this either. Some NGOs have been proponents of fish barriers on wild and scenic rivers. Some have been on the other side of it, litigating against fish barriers and chemical treatment of fish in wild places. But again, kind of our, American whitewater members and the boating community do seek out free flowing rivers. That's why we're advocates of wild and scenic rivers. But also we value native fish and healthy ecosystems and rivers. And so while we're staunch advocates for wild and scenic rivers, we also don't want to be at odds with native fish recovery. And we also really don't want to lose the support of fish managers and other key federal agencies when it comes to new wild and scenic river designations. And so we've been having this conversation for a while now, it feels like. And we really wanted to try and get at some standards and stipulations, considerations that are important to American whitewater. And that doesn't, speak for all nonprofits by any means. And this, what I'm about to share also kind of dovetails a little bit with some of the standards that Kate shared through the Forest Service recommendations and what's also been shared through the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. But we wanted to expand on that a little bit and address some more specifics. And so next slide, please. Yeah, so these, I'll kind of start out with some deal breakers. And so our perspective here is like, if these factors can't be worked around, or if this is going to be part of the design, then we, American Whitewater, doesn't want to see a barrier there. Hopefully you can appreciate my funny meme here with some grammar humor. But to get into the meat of it here, we have just a few things, which are all complicated. But if the fish barrier causes permanent damage to rivers, that's a no-go for us. And concrete, putting big construction devices in the river, building roads into a wild and scenic river, that would not pass that test. And if there really isn't a proven need, and if it's not aligned with existing values of that river, and so I would hope that, with all of these fish barrier projects, there would be a proven need, and there are native fish that need to be protected or reintroduced, and that we're not doing this, without good reason. The third one is that proponents of the project or other stakeholders haven't exhausted all possible other options. An example of that would be a natural barrier, one that can either be augmented a little bit or really just act as a barrier in itself without any modifications. And then if it includes designs or siting location that does unnecessarily harm other values or special places, putting it right in the middle of a, worldly renowned kayak run that then makes it unnavigable, or, putting it smack dab in the middle of a really popular scenic viewpoint that people hike to, that also is unacceptable. And really the last one here is not addressing the source of the problem prior to design and siting. And so in some instances, we've seen, the actual stocking of sport fish directly below where these projects are proposed. And so, really trying to get at the source of the problem before we're building more problems. And so, if all of these things can be met or avoided, then next slide, please. And so if we get into a situation where it does make sense to have a fish barrier, it's kind of past the preliminary test of, can it, avoid doing all these things? Can it be in a decent location? Can it have really, can it be really well thought out? Then we would also like to see these items happen if construction does follow through, or construction, or hopefully non-construction. But yeah, and some of these are a little bit repetitive, but really wanting to make sure that the fish barrier is aligned with outstandingly remarkable values. So in protecting identified fish as a part of an ORV, and then also protecting recreation and scenery, if those are ORVs as well. Having the smallest footprint possible. And that's not to say that the section of river being restored needs to be small, but the impacts at the fish barrier site should be small. Being able to maintain navigability for recreation, and if not, at least being able to provide portage, and so portage around a fish barrier. And then also considering impacts to all native species, and so taking a whole ecosystem approach and not just looking at single species management. So making sure that if there is a dam built there, how is that going to affect macroinvertebrates and other wildlife that are either in the river or in the riparian corridor. And then maintaining or enhancing water quality during and after construction. And then lastly, to have a plan to really closely monitor these river conditions after placement. Oftentimes we do these projects and they happen, and then there's not a lot to ensure that the impacts aren't really long lasting. And so having a good plan in place to make sure that water quality and sediment transport and everything, all of the above, are being monitored and hopefully mitigated for. And next slide, please. And so I offer a few just photo examples. A couple of these projects have already been mentioned, but this really just kind of revisits and gets at the question, can fish barriers and free-flowing rivers really coexist? I still don't have a definitive answer for you. It might be a little disappointing, but I think that the answer is still that it depends. And it depends on what values are present, where the project is located, what is the existing geomorphology of the river, how important is the role of sediment transport, And can you meet all the stipulations that I had previously mentioned as well? And so here are just like a few designs and just some quick hot takes from myself. And so Fossil Creek here on the left, there was actually a fish barrier in place already before it was designated. There's no recreation in particular on this segment. They were able to modify an existing waterfall. And I think that's, pretty decent. And Kate had kind of already mentioned this project down at the bottom, the Blue River in Arizona. You can see this is clearly a massive concrete structure. It was also built in recommended wilderness. Well, it's not a wild and scenic river. Super not aesthetic, potentially very dangerous for anglers and hikers if they fall in at higher water. And yeah, I would say I would not support this. And then in the top right here, it's a temporary barrier on the Lochsaw River. It's pretty ugly and definitely not navigable, but it could be portaged. It doesn't cause permanent damage to the riverbed, and it doesn't completely trap sediment. And this is a little bit better. It may not work for all types of fish or be possible on all rivers. For example, you couldn't put this directly below Class 5 rapid or on a tight corner and expect safe portage. But there are, a number of other stipulations and design elements that this does align with. So I'll wrap it up there. I think I went a little too long, but just really want to emphasize that I don't think there is no one size fits all approach here, but there's definitely a lot of people and different organizations that care about this topic. And a lot of them are associated with RMS. And so I think if you have a project that you're thinking about or a project that you don't like that somebody else is proposing, I, encourage you to use this space to have those conversations and reach out to myself, Matt, Kate, Risa, and others, because I would love to keep chatting about more projects out there.
And just to echo what Kestrel said, from the agency landowner perspective, this is definitely not a one size fits all approach. Every situation is complex and it really completely depends. And if a barrier is being considered in a certain area, it's going to be a lot of work between the proponent of the barrier, the landowner, as well as all of the partners at the table to get to a solution that works to preserve as many of the values as possible. So we can't offer one answer today, but can at least get at some of the nuances.
Matt, you want to also chime in with your "it depends" statement? Sorry.
My "it depends" statement. I guess I want to note that we all value streams, right? Like everyone is here because you place a lot of value on water. And so we value water for different reasons, but really we are all natural allies in protecting these places. And so just as Kestrel and many others on this call might think I'm crazy for advocating building a concrete wall across these waterways, I think it's insane that people that think so similarly to me are actively driving fish extinct because you're preventing the only conservation measures that we know work. So no one wants to build walls across creek. No one wants to build barriers. And eventually we are going to find other ways to solve these problems. But for now, we have a very small number of tools that work. And so I guess that's kind of there is no one size fits all, certainly for any particular problem. But until there are new tools, I think it would be much better if we could work together than try to actively prevent things. I don't know. That's my kumbaya attempt there. That's all.
You are muted, Risa.
Sorry, I just was suggesting, since there are so many of us, we should maybe go the raised hand route. So Mike, go, and then we can look at the chat as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Risa. And thanks you all for this presentation today. It's a super important topic. I'm Mike Fiebig with American Rivers. I work with Kestrel not only on the Upper Verde, but on the Gila as well, where we've also dealt with some proposed fish barriers on wild and scenic eligible streams. And my question is more for Kate and Matt. And Kestrel, first, I want to say thank you for sharing the criteria and stipulations that you did. I think they're common sense. They balance both the values of free-flowing rivers and of native fish. And I'm curious from Kate and Matt O'Neill, what your thoughts are on how your agencies do that balancing. Do you have your own stipulations and criteria? Because just as native fish, especially in the Southwest, are threatened and endangered, increasingly free-flowing rivers are rare and threatened as well. And we know that they're important for all species. So I'm curious if you all could talk about the criteria and stipulations that Kestrel laid out and how your agencies go toward balancing those two very important values.
Well, I can say pretty much everything that Kestrel laid out. I think as a Forest Service hydrologist and even as a Forest Service decision maker, as we step through a process of evaluating a fish barrier, we really do look holistically at all of those elements. And it depends on the management situation. And to me, it really depends overall on what the management scheme is. Like, is there a chance of actual success of a barrier? And if so, how do we get there? How do we put all the stipulations on that to get to meeting our forest plan, meeting the Endangered Species Act, and if applicable, meeting the Wilderness Act and Wild and Scenic? So I have to say I'm in complete agreement with those things. And I mean, I think the Upper Verde, although I mean, there's no perfect decision there, I think the Forest Service really did take a hard look at that and really did work collaboratively across agencies and partners to come to that decision. And while it's not an easy decision, I think it does show that we did consider all of that and that we really try to do that. But man, we don't make everybody happy, that's for sure.
And from a reclamation perspective, I'm not exactly the right person to be answering that question, but I'll give it a shot. And a lot of what I'm going to say comes from actually Kent Mosher, who I believe is, or at least was, on this call. And so kind of big picture reclamation, when we're talking about barriers, we're talking about a mitigation action that is required of us through a biological opinion. And so the thought process for us, I believe, starts with, okay, we need to do this. We are legally obligated to do something like this. And then we need to look for the physical sites where a barrier would be possible. And then we need to look at land ownership and consider all of the rest of the aspects from there. And so it's not really super helpful to look at, is this going to affect Wild and Scenic River values if there isn't the geological structure there to actually build a barrier anyways. From there, one of the things that I've learned with reclamation is that our first answer, the engineering first answer, is always concrete. And it is crazy how reclamation talks about concrete. Like, we have a week-long class that I could take to learn about concrete. And so that is certainly our first go-to answer. And as Kate talked about too, I think there are a lot of other potential methods that could be used to stop fish movement. And those are definitely going to be site specific and species specific. But I think there's some flexibility there. Yeah, I think that's the short reclamation answer. Kent, would you like to jump in and add anything to that if you're still on the call?
No, you handled it well, Matt.
Okay, thanks. And Mike, did that answer your question?
It did. That's helpful. At least it gets us going in the discussion a little more. I mean, we could dive deep on the Upper Verde in particular, but thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have some questions. We could begin to go through those. Oh, Jennifer's iPad. You can Please unmute.
Oh, thanks, Risa. Yeah, so this is Jennifer Back. I retired from the National Park Service and was somewhat involved with the issue on the Kashlaputa River before I retired. And just to add to some of the conversation that we've been having, it's a really difficult question. That is the Endangered Species Act versus the Wild and Scenic River values on the Kashlaputa. And the fact that the National Park Service was or is being used basically to mitigate actions that were done downstream is also sort of a complicating factor there. So there's really, at least at the time when I was involved, there's a lot of, mixed feelings about, what should be done with a barrier that was in wilderness and on a wild section of a wild and scenic river. And so I think, I think we've touched on that. I really appreciate each of your talks and the information that you've shared. But I think, each case is really unique and there's lots of information and stories and questions about particular rivers. And so it does get really complicated. But just one thing to sort of echo what Kestrel was saying is that when we were looking at it, at least the National Park Service, we were trying to be, a good player or whatever with the other agencies, but also we were thinking about function and aesthetics in addition to, when I say function, I mean hydrologic function and aesthetics, in addition to this need for, creating a barrier for non-native fish. And so I think what you all are touching on, Kate and Kestrel, in terms of the kinds of things that you're looking at about whether a barrier is necessary, will it work? And then if it does have to go in, is there a way to make it, sort of fit in better with the river itself? I think those are all really great points. And those are certainly some of the conversations that the National Park Service was having a few years ago. So I do want to just add one other thing, and that has to do with this comment about mitigation. And coming from the National Park Service, I feel kind of strongly about this, so I just want to throw this out. The idea that wild and scenic rivers are mitigation for large dams and other kinds of water resource projects. So when we talk about mitigation, I just really want people to be careful about trying to use a wild and scenic river as mitigation for something else, some other action, some other federal action, because they already are mitigation. So I'll just throw that out. And again, just really thank you all for sharing your experiences. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jennifer. Angie, you want to go to some questions? We have some questions from Matt Terry. What is the status of the proposed fish barrier on the Big South Fork of the Kashlaputa? Maybe we have experts here. Is there an update for folks who may not be familiar with what's going on?
I can just super quick because yeah, I'll keep it brief. There are 5 total fish barriers planned as part of that project. 2 of the 5 have been built, but those 2 are not in wilderness and are not on the wild and scenic portions. And so the project proponents, the Forest Service and the Park Service and others have not finalized designs for the remaining 3 and have also not gotten permit approval or past Section 7 analysis for the 3 that are on wilderness and or wild and scenic rivers. So that's the status, but happy to chat more offline too, Matt.
Thanks, Kestrel. Bud has sent a few questions. I'm going to read all of them, and maybe if any of you would like to tackle them. How are brook trout killed? Rodent known, unlike rivers, river water moves. How do barriers differ from USGS rock retention structures? Can they be built to satisfy both purposes? I'm not sure what both is. And why aren't designs of barriers including a facade of rock to make it blend naturally? I think we touched on that. if you're work for the Bureau of Reclamation, it's not possible. I'm just kidding, Matt. So that's style, efficiency maybe, but the other two, maybe some of you guys could respond to. Brook trout, maybe that's with your project, Kate.
Yeah, I responded a little bit in the chat, but yes, you can do rotenone eradication on moving water. It's very complex. You have to have drip stations set up in a very coordinated effort within like a couple 100 feet of each other. You have to have people with backpack sprayers getting like the side seeps and tributaries. It's very complicated, but it is possible. And this project has had really, really good success in brook trout eradication. And I can speak just a little bit to the rock retention structures. It really depends, I mean, on what fish species you're looking at and what fish species you're trying to exclude, what the actual characteristics of a barrier would need to be. Sometimes it's a jump height barrier. Sometimes it could be just like a long swim distance up where they couldn't make it. It really is very species dependent.
And since you've got yourself unmuted, Kate, I know we're coming down to time. Have you worked on a fish barrier project on an eligible and trapped suitable?
I have not. I did not work on the Upper Verde project. That was almost done before I got onto the forest. But Paul, I can definitely, if you reach out to me after this, connect you with some folks from the Forest Service perspective who have.
Yeah, I think we may have to, we have a couple of housekeeping things that we'd like to go through. But thanks for your other questions. And thanks you guys so much for your expertise. And, I think one thing that's great about you guys being here, you three being here, and the discussion is that one of the, I think, unique roles that RMS can play is to have kind of a neutral space for folks who have different, very different perspectives and sometimes conflicting perspectives. But our purpose, as Matt was saying, is that we're all in it to have rivers and the critters that live in and around them be here and healthy, years from now. So in general, our objectives are the same or similar. So go ahead, Angie, I'll let you take us out.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone. And just a reminder, we were recording today, and here's a link to our YouTube channel. You'll see that posted here probably in the next 24 hours, and then also sent out via email. And then just also some upcoming trainings that we've got going on, actually, and events. Our next roundtable is going to be on September 10th, and we're going to be looking at multilingual communication on your river. Also, before then, the A- Collaborative, which stands for Anti-Discrimination and Sexual Harassment on Rivers, is having starting out their series. And we're having a session on August 21st about discrimination, harassment, and assault. Also, for those interested in fluviogeomorphology and stream restoration, we are hosting a virtual course, a short course that's going to be taking place in November. And we also have an optional virtual field trip along with that. So I'll put some links here in the chat where you can go and find more information about some of these events. And then a couple other things to note for RMS members. We've got our Southeast chapter trip coming up on the James River, October 19th, and then also on the 11 Point River in October. So go to the website to find more info on those. And then lastly, we'd love to hear what you thought about today's session. And I'm going to put a link to a survey here in the chat. It's really short, just a few questions. So if you can take a moment to fill that out, we'd really appreciate that. We really do look at these surveys to find feedback and hear what you all thought and hear about any other future ideas and sessions and things like that. So thank you all again, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Joel.
Thank you.